Go4Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
Hello and welcome for today's episode of the Go4Leadership podcast. With me today is Dr. Taryn Marie, and I'm very welcome her to the show.
Hello, Daniel, and hello, everyone listening in today.
Go4Leadership interviews.
Perfect. Taryn, as we usually ask the guests to introduce themselves, I give you 30 seconds.
30 seconds. All right. Well, it's great to be with you today, Daniel, and it's great to be with all of your listeners. It's an honor to speak to all of you. I am Dr. Taryn Marie Stejskal. I founded a company called Resilience Leadership Institute, and I am the founder and chief resilience officer. Prior to that, I was leading executive leadership development and talent strategy at Nike. And I also led global leadership development for Cigna, a global health insurer, for a number of years.
Awesome. And I think to develop people, in particular also by helping leaders to become better leaders, you already should have a certain perspective or definition what leadership or good or bad leadership maybe is, or how would you define leadership?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was at Nike, Nike had a tagline where they would say, we were there in support of athletes, right? And then there'd be like a little asterisk after athlete, and it would say, if you have a body, you're an athlete, right? Mm-hmm. And I started to think about that relative to leadership development. And so in some of my writing, I've started to put an asterisk above leader or leadership. And then the asterisk reads, if you have a heart and a mind, you're a leader. And that's really important because so often we think of leadership as being a title, a scope of responsibility, direct reports, influence, right? And the idea is if we really think about it, there's probably at least one person in each of our lives that looks up to us, that sees us as a role model, whether that's in a professional or a corporate setting at work, if we lead a team, maybe we mentor someone that's behind us in our career. Maybe it's a niece or nephew or a neighbor, And so the point is, we are all leaders. And when we start to embrace that, when we stop looking around and we say, well, when are the leaders going to come? Or when is the cavalry going to show up? We are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are all leaders, and therefore we all have great power. And therefore, with great power comes great responsibility.
I love that, and like we said in the welcome phase of let's say the behind the curtain, we discussed that leaders in particular, let's say the leadership development has a lot to do with ourselves, and I think that's a great definition of yourself of leadership, that it begins with ourselves. So how in your day-to-day work, if you work with leaders, how do you bring this message across that change or development, let's say, starts with the leader itself?
Mm-hmm. Well, this occurs both personally and professionally, right? Mm-hmm. And so in order to bring about this idea that, change starts with us, right? And of course, I'm not the first one to say this. Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change that you want to see, right? Michael Jackson wrote a whole song about the man in the mirror and the change starting with the person that we see in the mirror. And so oftentimes when people say, I wish I had this or I wish I had that, in romantic relationships, people will say, well, I want to meet someone special. I want to meet someone wonderful. And I'll say, oh yeah. And they'll say, yeah. And I'll say, oh, well, like, what are the qualities of the person that you would like to fall in love with? And they'll list out, the qualities, right? Well, they're kind and they're supportive and they listen and they're funny and they're adventurous and they like to travel. And I say, great, now go become all of those things and you will attract those things to you, right? And so within the context of our professional lives, rather than saying, we wish things were a certain way, we wish people were different, we are within our own control. And so the difference starts with us.
So I like that a lot. And I think it has a lot to do with self-reflection in order to make yourself aware that you might need to change in a certain way. What I find always difficult is how to, let's say, maintain this certain way of change. How do you foster, let's say, and make it a daily habit, so to say?
Mm-hmm. Well, now I'm going to say something opposite of what I just said, which is the other side of that coin, which is, we are the ones we've been waiting for. The cavalry isn't coming. We are the cavalry, become the leader, that you want to see or you want to have in your life. The flip side of that coin is companies and organizations have a tremendous responsibility to foster leadership, to create the environment in which leaders thrive, to create the environment in which people are able to be resilient, the environment in which people are able to live and work in a sustainable way. And so the other side of that coin is, that resilience is a team sport. And so what that means is when we invest in ourselves, when we invest in our own development, our leadership strengths and skills, when we invest in our own healing, doing the good and hard work of looking at ourselves and the trauma and the wounds that we've had and what's holding us back, and how that plays out in our personal life and how that plays out in our professional life, around the office and the Zoom room, right? Anything we do to enhance ourselves, it's the rising tide of humanity that lifts all boats, right? So your healing, your reflection, your introspection, Danielle, is my healing, is my reflection, is my introspection, right? We're all deeply connected, is my belief. And resilience is a team sport, right? So if we're on the same team, your up-leveling your leadership is going to invite me to up-level myself, and me up-leveling myself is going to invite you to up-level. In addition to that, we're not acting sort of on an island or in isolation or in a vacuum, right? So organizations systemically have a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous responsibility to support their people, our people, in reducing stress, in reducing burnout, in managing workloads, and supporting mental health, and creating environments that are sustainable and foster resilience. So that's another important piece to mention. But the question that you asked me is, how do we do that, right? How do we create, a sustainable habit? There are a lot of people who are much better at fostering and facilitating habits and routines than I am. So I'll point to one of them, right? Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit, is, a wonderful book if you haven't read it, or as a listener if you haven't read it. And it really looks at, what are the things that embed habit and routine, and how do we truly make change over time? Because we know as humans that's difficult to do.
Absolutely. You touched a topic that I think very interesting is that you are not on a single island. So you are within a group of people in a normal setting, let's say, even within a family, right? You have maybe a partner, friends, kids, whatever. So how do you integrate them in this, let's say, development routine, let's say, put it into the professional life? So how do you open up the team for an open feedback philosophy or culture, so that you push yourself, let's say, within the team up? Because I mean, in my experience, there are always some that are willing to do, but there are also those little ones that are not willing to do. So how do you get the group jointly together to do it?
Yeah, so many things about that, Danielle. It's a great question. So the first thing that I'll mention just contextually is we are in this incredible moment of human reflection, of human inflection, where for the first time in a century, we are sharing a universal experience with every other human around the globe, right? 7 billion people connected by this universal experience of a global pandemic called COVID-19. So there's this tremendous universal connection that exists between all of us in this moment in time, right? I mean, think about, when was the last time you turned on the news and you saw a civil war someplace or a famine someplace and you're like, gosh, that sounds really rough and I cannot relate to that, right? We have this moment where COVID-19 is a common universal human thread that is tying us all together. And so we're in this moment of universality and really understanding that we are all deeply connected. You know, the greatest lie that we ever told ourselves as humans is that we're individuals and that our behavior happens in isolation and doesn't impact anyone else, right? The greatest truth of what it means to be human and to be a sentient being is to know that our actions, our behavior, our thoughts deeply and appreciably impact the world and everyone else and everything around us. So certainly with the pandemic, we have this universal experience. Now there's unique experiences too, right? We all have a unique experience. Your experience with the pandemic and COVID-19 won't be my experience, right? So there's uniqueness, right? Which we get to value and appreciate. And there's this universal, right? And so that's tremendously exciting to me, because then what you say next is we have this sort of moment where we really get to see that we're all connected. And so then when we get people together and you know, I think your question was about behavior change, right? How do you foster, you know, behavior change on a team? And there's really two ways that you do that, right? The first one is, as a leader, you role model the behavior that you want to see, right? And by doing that, you encourage others that, one, this behavior is going to be accepted, and two, that this is a psychologically safe place where other people can act in that way. So if you want to drive authenticity on your team, right? If you want to drive a feedback-driven culture, right, as you mentioned, then you as the leader must take the first step and role model that, so people have an example for what that looks like. They know that behavior will be accepted. And two, they know it'll be psychologically safe, right? The next thing that you do after you role model the behavior is you reward the behavior, right? So when people give you feedback, you reward it, right? When people act in an authentic way, that was a tongue twister. When people act in an authentic way, you know, you reward that if that's what you're after, right? And so now you're rewarding people to show them, you know, not only, you know, my talk matches my walk, right? What I'm asking for, people are doing, you know, and then, you know, you go to the other people on the team, right? So the early adopters you reward, right? And then the people that are sort of lagging, right? You know, start to look at how can you reward them. Now, if people don't come along with you, right, then that's a conversation around, hey, we're doing this thing, right? We're giving feedback. We're all getting authentic, you know? And then we get to figure out as leaders, for the people that are not coming along with us, why aren't they coming along with us, right? And there's two reasons that people don't come along with us, right? There's skill and there's will, right? That's what it boils down to, right? Either people don't have the skills to come along with us. Hey, I see you being authentic. Hey, I see you giving feedback. Even though I've seen it, I'm not sure I know how to do that, right? So they need to adopt the skills, right? Or there's will, where they have the skills, but they're like, I don't want to be authentic. That's not what I'm about. I don't want to give feedback, right? So it's either a won't do, and you know, in terms of skill, or a can't do, right, in terms of will. And that's what you have to figure out for the people that aren't adopting. And you know, we do our level best when we're up leveling our teams to help people grow and change around us. And once we've tried to grow and change the people around us in all of those myriad ways, and if people don't come along, you know, then we think about changing the people around us, right?
But I love that, and I think that that's spot on how to evolve as a team, and that brings back, let's say, the responsibility as well as a leader and as a role model, and as a somebody that reflects is empathic, also understanding why maybe there are individuals not following or not, let's say, like you said, willing or having the capabilities of transforming, let's say, or building up to the model that you want to foster in the team. So when working at Nike, in particular with the leadership development, so how do you prepare new generations to become good leaders? Can you give me a hint also? What is your perspective on that path?
Yeah, so when I was working at Nike, I was working in executive development and talent strategy. And so what that meant was I'd worked for a number of years at Cigna as global head of leadership development. And when I went to Nike, I had the opportunity to have a much narrower role, really focused on the top of the house, right? Mark Parker, his executive team, and our top vice presidents within the organization. So in that role, I wasn't really working directly with, the next, sort of generation of leaders. And what was exciting to me is sort of working at the top of the house in that way. What we got to think about was like broadly across the organization, as we're developing leaders, in the highest kind of roles, what is that cascading effect, right? That then is going to trickle down to leaders and support, those that are emerging. What's interesting is, I joined Nike shortly after, and this is all public information that was in the in the news, where 11 very senior executives were asked to leave the organization largely because of gender discrimination against women. So I came into the organization at a really kind of key inflection point, at a really important time where Nike had the opportunity to respond to this notion, right, that they were really lagging in terms of gender equity. And in fact, the careers of many women were highly, negatively impacted by the behavior of some of these senior executives. And so when we think about, how do we sort of develop the next generation of leaders, if you will, if I stay with this thread of developing women, this is a really important topic right now in the midst of the pandemic. In the United States, 2 million women have left the workforce in the last year. The gap between the number of men that are employed and the number of women that are employed is widening, right, through the pandemic. In addition to that, if you look at the job numbers, in the United States, for example, in the month of December, in December of 2020, we had 150,000 people, right, leave the workforce. 100% of them were women. So, there's of course many things that we can do to support, emerging leaders. I'm concerned right now about the support that we're offering women in the workforce, and what we're finding is that women are exhausted. I'm exhausted. I have a 9-year-old and a soon-to-be 7-year-old, and when the pandemic started, they were 8 and 5. And trying to juggle virtual learning, which literally took like 6 to 8 hours a day with like multiple, it becomes like a full-time job, and then you're like, and then your kids don't just want you to be a teacher. They also, want you to be a mom, right? Like play with us, read us books, right? And make dinner and do all those things, right? So I was sleeping like 4 hours a night because I was working a shift with them for virtual learning, and then working a shift as a mom, right? And then putting in a third shift in order to be able to run my business, right? In the midst of the pandemic as a head of my own household and at the time a single woman. And so, I think we really need to be thinking hard about how we're supporting women with families right now, whether that's permission to drop the ball before they drop out of the workforce. I mean, certainly that's got to be better. whether that's orienting people more toward progress as opposed to perfection. Women to a greater degree than men tend to be perfectionists. There's research to demonstrate when women look at a job description, if we don't have like 100% of the things in the job description, we don't go for the job, but men will look at it and be like, I've got 60%, submit my application, right? By the way, I'm one of the women who would submit if I only have 60% of the stuff. I might submit if I only have 30 if I want the job, but the vast majority of women, don't do that, right? Or whether that's, subsidizing childcare for women, sending somebody to the house who can take care of the kids for a couple of hours, during the day, or creating a hybrid work schedule where women who are working in, for traditional corporations and companies have the opportunity to work, various hours around their children's virtual learning, right? I mean, these are some really kind of tactical and practical elements. And, we're in this moment where there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of burnout, and women, men are stressed out too, right? But the folks that are leaving the workforce are primarily female.
I like that swing, Taryn, because at the end, of course, I mean, we are all stressed out, but I think that in particular is something that we as people that deal with leaders, I think need to also take that into consideration, right? That you have your ups and downs, and in particular now within a female leader that you can't ignore, but there are certain, of course, responsibilities attached, right? You said it by yourself. You have kids to deal with in the pandemic. You are a teacher, you are a chef, you are a kindergartenist, you are literally all what has to be covered. You are a consultant for the kids. You are a mom. You I don't know, whatever it is. So and how also organizations can be much more, let's say, open for such, let's say, or to foster environments where actually female leaders can perform in this, let's say, difficult challenge. Because at the end, I think, like you said, why things happens like that female leaders lose first the job before maybe a male leader lose the job. So how we can overcome that habits and that unnice actions from companies.
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot of the suggestions that I mentioned, right, which are to subsidize in-home childcare. I mean, just provide in-home childcare in the first place, right? Access to it, and perhaps, subsidize it because childcare is expensive. Mm-hmm. To offer hybrid work schedules, for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. Men too, right? That way, women and men that are in heterosexual relationships and partnerships, they can each maybe work a few non-traditional hours and also, make sure the kids get on their virtual learning and their Zoom calls. So having those, hybrid schedules, talking with, our workforce about the dangers of perfectionism, that this is simply a luxury that we can't afford right now, and to prioritize progress over perfection, to look at, work products, right? And to figure out, what are sort of the superfluous elements of a work product, right? Like maybe there's a template we can create. Maybe we can simplify a procedure. Maybe when we have a deliverable, we can figure out, what's sort of the minimum viable product, right? Sort of the MVP around that deliverable, to allow people to continue to engage, but recognize that people are being pulled, in a myriad of different directions, right? So I think, those are some places, where we can start.
I like that. And I think something that I've found out as well in my professional career, it's so hard sometimes for organization to define what should be the output. because at the end, I think everybody can, as a leader as well, or within a project, or as individual employee, once there is a clear definition of the output, at the end, my former boss always said, I mean, at the end, it counts the result. How you achieve the result, I mean, you could spend hundreds of hours trying to get to the same result, or you could just think of it and do 1 hour, and this is a smart invested hour, and you come to the same result. So I think to get to this point, you need diversity to get the best people, be it male, woman, different kind of cultures, backgrounds, to come up to that level of professionalism and perfectionism, that you really are output driven. But to come to that point, it's very essential that companies think of it. What is the expectation I have to leaders, or to organizations, or to teams? And I found out that that's really hard sometimes to make it crisp or smart. How to say? Do you that does it resonate to you, or do you think that's a point?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? Clearly defined kind of objectives or results or road mapping along, what is expected, right? Sort of what does the output look like, or what is the, ideal look like, I think is wonderful, In addition to that, I think there's so much work, right, that you and I do, that maybe isn't project based, right? And the more senior you become in an organization, the more it's about it's less about output and more about influence, right? Now there are, in sort of like, I don't like the word middle management really, but I'll just use it so we all sort of know what we're talking about. But, there's the working leader, right? Or the manager who also produces, right? So in many organizations, in addition to leading teams and people, that individual also has their own work product, their own output, their own expectations, right? As you get higher in the organization, right, how you influence and how you lead becomes a greater part, of that role. And so, I think crystallizing some of the squishier elements of that around, like, how do you generate followership? How do you ensure that you're communicating powerfully and prolifically across your organization? How do you ensure that people are getting the message, right? Those things can be harder, although, no less important to really detail, what does the outcome look like, or what does success look like?
So as you worked also within organizations that may have a, let's say, gender challenge to overcome, how did you brought into senior executives that there should be no relevance, let's say, which gender it is? It's just about getting the best person, whomever it is, for the right role. So how did you brought this into the DNA of an organization?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much here. Where do I start? Well, the first thing is, we all have biases that we bring, to work and to the interview process and to that process of, who is, the person who's the best fit for the role. And one of my favorite books, I believe it was Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell talked about how symphonies had, dramatically more male members of the symphony than female members of the symphony. And so what they started doing is they started doing tryouts for the symphony behind a screen. So the judges could not see the gender of the individual, right? Whether they were man or woman. For the tryout, they could only hear the instrument. They could only hear the music. And I don't remember the percentage, but in some, the symphony having gone to blind trials behind the screen, all of a sudden, the seats that they had in their symphony dramatically increased, right, in terms of what was being held by women. And so this is a tremendous sort of illustrative example of sometimes our cognitive biases play tricks on us, right? Because we see a man and we think, well, a man, should, I'm just giving an example, should be the tuba, tuba is a male instrument, French horn is male, I don't know. But, we have these sort of biases, right? And so just objectively saying, well, how do we find the best person for the job? It's really hard to parse out our own biases with that person's own experience, right? So I think part of finding the best person for the job is finding a way to do blind interviews to some extent, right? Where we're not sort of revealing the person's, gender later on. In addition to that, what we find is that, in my opinion, it's not just about finding the right person for the job. It's also about finding the right person for the team, right? So, what we know is that teams that are more diverse, right? Initially, there's more discomfort. There can be less psychological safety initially, right? But over time, those teams that have diversity in gender, in ethnicity, in race, in thought, in experience, right? It's not all seen diversity. Those teams that have diversity actually make better decisions over time, right? So there's like a wonderful study that was done on several college campuses where they brought together groups of students to solve a murder mystery, right? The students that they brought together that were from the same fraternity or the same sorority, after the problem-solving exercise, they interviewed them and they said, how did you think you did, right? And what was that experience like for you? The students that came from the same fraternity or the same sorority, who identified with one another already, performed worse, but thought they did better. Because we're all together, it's me and you, Daniel, and it's a bunch of our friends, and like, we're all agreeing and we're doing great and we're amazing, right? And so that's what happens, right? With leadership teams and executive teams, it's really hard sometimes, not to recognize, we don't know what we don't know, right? And so that seen and unseen diversity is tremendously important. I mean, I forget the statistics, but a company just having like one woman on their board or in the C-suite, revenue increases something like 7% for that business, right? Because you're starting to tap into this diversity of thought that, we all don't naturally come up with on our own, right? And then you see the trickle down effect of that diversity within an organization where when you have one woman on the board or in the C-suite, you start to have higher levels of women in the context of that organization. Why is that important, right? Well, if you work for Toyota, right, 85% of the purchasing decisions in a household are made by a woman, right? If you work for Cigna, 85 to 90% of the decisions that are made about medical procedures and medical care for other members of the household are made by a woman, right? So you want your organization's composition to reflect the clients and customers that you're trying to serve.
I like that, and I think that's great examples of how to foster that, and very I won't say easy to execute, but very clear hints how to evolve as an organization. Thank you so much, Taryn. Let's come to the last question, and like I usually ask, what you have said to yourself before you actually started your career, and maybe also reflecting what we just discussed a little bit would be very awesome to understand from you.
Yeah, I don't know what I said to myself. Here I'll tell you what happened. Here's what happened. I started out believing that I was going to be a clinical psychologist, and then I believed that I was going to sort of build this bridge between, call it psychology, clinical psychology, health psychology, neuropsychology, and traditional, physical medicine, right? And my fellowship And my dissertation, when I was getting my doctorate degree, was all about bridging these two and how we can create a formalized, programmatic approach to supporting individuals, couples, and families after one person sustained a neurological injury, right? And then I thought that was going to be my career. And then we were able to expand the aperture of that and create this tremendous programming that reached, thousands of people. And I thought, well, I achieved that goal, so what's next? And then I started to think about leadership, right? So first I was a consultant, then I went in-house and led global leadership development. Then I went to Nike and led executive development. Now I'm leading my own company as an entrepreneur, having done research on, resilience and what makes people resilient and the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, for a decade and a half. And now I'm in the midst of this global inflection point where resilience was nice to have, 14 months ago. It's become an imperative. And I've had the, tremendous blessing and good fortune and providence to have researched what makes us resilient in leadership and in life for the last decade and a half, so that I was ready at this moment, not knowing that it would occur, to be of service to my clients, to the teams that I work with, to the executives, to the organizations, to the actors, to the artists, to the athletes. And I don't know what I said to myself before I started, because each one of those summits I thought was the pinnacle. And each time I got to that summit, I realized, okay, there's something more that I want to do. So I don't know what I would have said to myself before I started, but what I'd say to myself now, looking back, is I'd say, keep going, because what you think you're going to achieve is a far cry from what you're actually going to achieve, and it's going to be awesome.
I love that. That's a very great final statement.
Go4Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
Thank you so much for being our guest today, Taryn. All the best. Stay safe.
Thank you, Daniel. What an honor.
Go4Leadership, the podcast.